Olá, olá, bom dia a todos. Sejam bem-vindos a mais uma live do Instituto Sivis, think tank focado na promoção dos verdadeiros valores democráticos. Hoje estamos aqui para falar um pouco sobre um tema recente e urgente mundo afora, que é a regulação do espaço digital e como proteger os direitos fundamentais, as liberdades fundamentais no espaço da internet. Diante desse crescente debate regulatório aqui no Brasil, iremos discutir os principais aprendizados de uma das primeiras leis pioneiras e referências mundo afora, que é o DSA, o Digital Services Act da União Europeia. Olhando para o contexto brasileiro, em termos de riscos, boas práticas e desafios para construirmos uma regulação que proteja o debate público e os verdadeiros valores democráticos nos direitos fundamentais. O Instituto Sivis teve o prazer de publicar, ao final do ano passado, a pesquisa chamada DSA Brasileiro, Caminhos para a Regulamentação e Proteção da Liberdade de Expressão Digital, disponível no nosso site civis.org.br. E temos o prazer hoje de trazer aqui dois apresentadores envolvidos diretamente na produção desse relatório e que nos ajudarão a discutir um pouco mais em profundidade os principais achados dessa pesquisa e que nos direcionarão para os próximos debates nesse assunto. Aqui comigo temos, primeiramente, professor, advogado e pesquisador do ITS Rio, Matheus Mantuani. Bom dia, Matheus.
Bom dia, Jamil. Bom dia, pessoal. Muito prazer estar aqui com vocês.
Muito bom, obrigado, Matheus, pela presença. E de agora em diante, nós faremos uma apresentação também em inglês, na qual nós traremos as apresentações do relatório, dos principais achados do relatório pelo Matheus, e também a discussão com o professor convidado e revisor do nosso material, professor, doutor e pesquisador da área de Direitos Humanos e Liberdade de Expressão do Center for Law, Democracy and Society, da Queen Mary University, professor Joan Barata. Logo, logo ele se reconecta aqui conosco. Tivemos um pequeno problema técnico, mas que antes de começarmos esse debate, e que, reforço, faremos em inglês, com disponibilidade de legendas aqui na plataforma, nós gostaríamos de passar um vídeo institucional dos apoiadores desse projeto e parceiros cruciais para essa discussão de direitos fundamentais aqui do Brasil, da Embaixada dos Países Baixos do Brasil, com o seu segundo secretário, Jelle Flot, que gravou um vídeo para nós, que a gente vai passar aqui agora, com um breve comentário da Embaixada sobre esse projeto.
O meu nome é Júlio Flot, sou diplomata responsável para assuntos políticos e de direitos humanos aqui na Embaixada do Reino dos Países Baixos, em Brasília. É um prazer cumprimentar os representantes desse evento e agradecer a presença de cada um de vocês. Em nome da Embaixada, gostaria de expressar nossa satisfação em apoiar o projeto Caminhos para a Proteção da Liberdade de Expressão Digital, desenvolvido em parceria com o Instituto Sivis, no âmbito do Fundo de Direitos Humanos 2025. Esse projeto aborda um tema de grande relevância e atualidade, como promover a liberdade de expressão no ambiente digital, ao mesmo tempo em que enfrentamos desafios como a desinformação e os riscos às instituições democráticas. A análise das experiências europeias, especialmente a partir do Digital Services Act e do Digital Markets Act, oferece contribuições importantes ao destacar tanto boas práticas quanto desafios regulatórios. Nos Países Baixos mesmo, o debate sobre a implementação do Digital Services Act tem sido acompanhado de perto, com ênfase na importância da transparência, da responsabilidade das plataformas e da proteção dos direitos fundamentais no ambiente digital. Ao mesmo tempo, reconhecemos claramente que cada país possui suas próprias realidades. Por isso, achamos fundamental que essas lições sejam adaptadas ao contexto brasileiro, respeitando seus marcos legais, sua diversidade e o compromisso com os direitos fundamentais. Bora, eu espero que este evento seja uma oportunidade para todos vocês estimular o diálogo entre os presentes. E desejo-lhes um excelente evento, com debates produtivos e inspiradores. Muito obrigado e boa tarde.
Então, muito obrigado novamente à Embaixada do Reino dos Países Baixos aqui do Brasil, na pessoa do seu segundo secretário, Jelle Flot. E agora nós vamos transicionar para o inglês, para fazermos a apresentação e o debate desse relatório. So now, back to English language, and I welcome now, effectively, Professor Joan Barata, researcher at Queen Mary University at the Center for Law, Democracy and Society. So thanks again, Professor Juan, for being here with us.
Thank you. Sorry, apologies for the technical glitch, but now I'm here and everything is okay.
All right. So, as I mentioned before, the report published by Sivis with the help and the participation and authorship of Professor Matheus and technical accompaniment by Professor Joan Barata and others was published just last year in December by Sivis Institute, and is available at our website. And we hope that the discussion that we start here in this live webinar can move forward on the channels that we have available in our social media networks, our institutional emails, and the other events that we participate. So ourselves at Sivis and the authors remain at the disposal for the continuing of this discussion. And before we jump into the main findings of the report, and I pass the word to Professor Matheus, I would like just to give a brief context on why Sivis Institute thought this was an important discussion for the moment here in Brazil. Worldwide is well known, we are moving through very deep changes in how the public debate and how citizens deal with technologies, especially the digital space. However, these changes, they came with they basically remixed old challenges that we already faced as democracies around the world. A big expansion of the public sphere comes not only with its good parts, more inclusion, more participation, but also it amplifies the risks and that come with an expansion of the public debate. For example, disinformation, especially during electoral periods, can grow a lot and foster more and more effective polarization and animosity and feelings of disengagement from the politics and political debate. So as we take a look at this scenario, worldwide internet regulation is being debated and experimented, and the European Union can provide us with an interesting case study on how their regulations are being implemented in these past few years. And our vision at Sivis is, although these regulations are necessary and urgent, we need to pay close attention as how these regulations can sometimes affect positively or negatively human rights, access to information, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and other fundamental rights. So it's crucial that these regulations protect civil liberties, citizens' participations, journalists, and others that are affected by this in the public debate, but we need to move forward and how to deal better with these regulations as a society and as democracies. It's our role to be here and discuss these with evidence, with research, and that's where we come in with the help of these distinguished professors here. So now I would like to ask Matheus here to give a brief layout of the main findings of the report that we just launched, and later we will discuss some questions, Professor Barata, Matheus, and us, on the main unfoldings of this research report. So Matheus, take it away.
Thanks, Jamil. Hello again, everyone. First of all, I would like to thank Instituto Sivis, Jamil, Sara, Joan for the invitation and for organizing this webinar. I also want to thank Professors Joan Barata and Francisco Brito Cruz for their help reviewing the document, as well as the Embassy of the Netherlands, whose partnership allowed us to foster a qualified dialogue on digital regulation between Brazil and the European Union. It's a privilege to be a part of this event with you today. And I would like to make a preliminary remark. The report we are presenting today is a policy paper, and its purpose is to contribute to the debate and invite experts to delve deeper into these discussions. It is a paper guided by a specific premise that any regulatory reform regarding the responsibilities and obligations of digital platforms must be built within the frameworks of freedom of expression and human rights. And with that caveat in mind, I will move on to presenting the report. The European Digital Services Act, applicable since February 2024, represents the most comprehensive reform of digital services regulation in the European Union since the e-commerce directive. And the regulation was designed to respond to a specific diagnosis that intermediaries like social networks and online marketplaces can facilitate risks to online safety, fundamental rights, and democratic debate in a context of regulatory fragmentation across member states. The DSA establishes a tiered system of obligations. All providers of intermediary services must designate points of contact, maintain transparent terms and conditions, and report on content moderation actions. Providers of hosting services are subject to standardized notice and action mechanisms and must provide a statement of reasons for decisions restricting content. Online platforms, in turn, face broader obligations such as internal complaint handling systems, out-of-court dispute settlement, priority treatment for notices from trusted flaggers, and transparency regarding advertising and recommender systems. And at the top of this regulatory pyramid, the so-called VLOPs and VLOSEs, very large platforms and search engines with more than 45 million active recipients of the service in the European Union, must conduct annual assessments of systemic risks, undergo independent audits, provide advertisement repositories, grant data access to vetted researchers, and maintain independent compliance functions. The report identifies several challenges in implementing the DSA. First, the obligations regarding systemic risks introduce indeterminate legal concepts whose concrete application will depend on guidelines from the European Commission and case law that obviously isn't yet consolidated. And second, the regulatory burden is also considerable. Annual audits, supervisory fees, algorithm transparency, guaranteed data access. All these entail high operational costs, and the designation as a VLP is based exclusively on the number of users rather than market power or the actual risks posed by each provider. And the third, it's the concept of trusted flaggers, designed to expedite the removal of manifestly illegal content, which raises legitimate concerns. The lack of an express limit on the number of trusted flaggers, combined with the discretionary power of national authorities in certifying them, may create pressure for excessive content removals. And finally, the absence of consolidated regulatory details on key provisions, such as the concept of actual knowledge of illegal content, the limits of the prohibition on general monitoring obligations, and proportionality criteria, creates legal uncertainty that compromises even the circulation of legitimate, albeit controversial speech. And these findings seem to indicate that it is premature to treat the GSA as a paradigmatic model to be readily adopted by Global South countries. And Brazil has its own regulatory trajectory, grounded in the Internet Bill of Rights, the Marco Civil da Internet, a 2014 law that prioritized freedom of expression and established a regime of subjective liability by omission. Providers would only be held liable for third-party content if, following a specific court order, they fail to remove it. And this model was declared partially unconstitutional by the Brazilian Supreme Court in 2025. The court's thesis recognized that the general rule in Article 19 of the Marco Civil no longer provided sufficient protection for certain constitutional legal goods, establishing new scenarios for liability. For example, regarding paid boosting of illegal content or systemic failures in removing severe criminal posts. In parallel, legislative discussions have intensified, especially with Bill 2630, 2020, and a new draft bill that has been labeled as a sort of Brazilian DSA. And this is precisely where the report focuses its concerns, the possibility that these initiatives might perform an inadequate legal transplant, and critically importing concepts designed for socioeconomic and institutional realities vastly different from our own. And the report identifies 4 core risks. First, regulation that excessively expands liability tends to produce overblocking and the so-called chilling effect, resulting in excessive removals and self-censorship, and disproportionately affecting journalists, human rights defenders, and citizens in vulnerable socioeconomic situations. And second, qualified notice mechanisms might consolidate informational hierarchies that favor institutionalized actors to the detriment of independent journalists and smaller civil society organizations. Third, disproportionate obligations could make alternative platforms unviable and consolidate the dominant market positions of big tech companies. And fourth, centralizing regulatory competences without adequate mechanisms for social participation might replicate the democratic deficits already observed in the Brazilian experience with regulatory agencies. And given these risks, the report proposes that future Brazilian regulation strictly observe constitutional limits for restricting fundamental rights, including the tripartite tests of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which requires legality, necessity, and proportionality. We suggest 5 paths here: self-regulation of due process in content moderation, transparency reporting obligations regarding moderation rules and their enforcement, co-regulation combining principle-based legal norms with sectorally negotiated codes of conduct, responsive regulation favoring a gradation of interventions, and the recognition that regulation doesn't end with the law. It must mobilize legislation, code, the market, and social norms. And as I pointed out at the beginning of my speech, this is an initial contribution to the debate. We hope it helps strengthen Brazil's ability to discuss independently and creatively solutions tailored to its own particularities in constant dialogue with freedom of expression and human rights. Thank you once again to Instituto Sivis and the Embassy of the Netherlands for this opportunity, and that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Matheus, very much. My colleagues will post in the chat soon enough here the link to have access to the report, and later possibly we'll be able to share also the slides Matheus prepared for debating these main findings. So in short, the summary of our risks identified and the proposals, the guiding principles that we propose for further regulatory debate. I restate here also, Matheus, backing up, that this is by no means the end of this debate. Of course, we don't have the ability in a policy paper such as this to discuss all of the implications. This is focused on one specific bill. We plan on future endeavors discussing the other regulation regarding digital markets, and how other stuff, other bills coming from other parts of the world are influencing the Brazilian political debate. And hopefully, as Matheus stated, we can again put Brazil in the forefront of these regulatory matters with proposals that are tailor-made for our reality, that actually adapt to Brazilian culture and to Brazilian legislation. So I would like now to pass the word to Professor Juan. And before I ask a few questions, I would like to ask him, how was your experience in reading this report and the main findings, especially our proposals moving forward here for the Brazilian regulation? And if you would like as well, summarize the main learnings that the DSA has already provided for the member countries of the European Union.
Sure. First of all, thank you for the invitation. Secondly, what I would like to say is that, as I already told you, personally, so to speak, I think that this is a very important report in Brazil. I think that so far the debate in Brazil is so much politicized, and I think that it is very good to have a technical report in the legal sense that clarifies the main legal notions, that clarifies what is at stake in comparison with the system of the Marco Civil, the risks that we are facing in Brazil if the reform doesn't go in the right direction, and the importance, again, to have a debate that is not only at the political level, that a debate that is not only along the political divisions between left and right, so to speak, and because this is a country which is at this point, I would say, very much polarized. And of course, the fact that social media was misused in the recent past by a certain part of the political spectrum may look like, those who are in favor of regulating belong to one side, and those who are against regulation belong to the other side. I think this would be extremely wrong as an approach. No, so I think that we need to be cautious and to avoid, let's say, the excessive politicization of this debate in Brazil. I think that this law will have to be applied by different governments, and we need to be aware of that. So we need to make sure that this law is not misused by any government. No, that does not open the door to possible abuse by any government. So that, first of all, and I think that, in this sense, the report plays this role. No, it says, what are the elements, what are the main principles that should orientate the law. No? When it comes to the EU, it's true that the Digital Services Act is something relevant beyond the European Union. It's true because it's a new model of regulation. It's a regulation that is not only based on the, let's say, dichotomy between liability and liability exemptions. It goes beyond that because it protects liability exemptions while at the same time establishes new responsibilities for platforms. No? And I think that it is very important to understand the difference between preserving intermediary liability exemptions, which are still there, and introducing new responsibilities for platforms. There's no need to eliminate intermediary liability restrictions in order to impose more obligations for platforms. No, and this is the first thing that European debate shows. The second thing, of course, is that in the European system, this new model consisting of establishing new administrative responsibilities has forced platforms to create their own European incorporations. No? Now we have platforms that are European and that have to follow the European legal system, which is something that, of course, from a political point of view, from a legal point of view, it is seen by citizens also as something that makes them feel safer. It's not that these are platforms that come from somewhere else. No, these are platforms that have their offices in Dublin, in the European Union, and therefore are subject to a series of legal principles and standards that are applicable in the European Union. No? And this is something that creates a certain level of legal certainty and a feeling feeling of legal protection, which is always important. The other thing, of course, that I mean, we can learn from the European experience. It is that this is very complicated, no? Because apart from adopting a norm that is long, that is complex, that requires to be properly understood, you also need to create and implement an institutional system, and you also need to create and implement all the different figures, agents that are contemplated by the law. And this has already been mentioned here, I mean, by the way of the description of the report, no? Because first of all, we have, I mean, the DSA has forced European member states to designate regulatory bodies to implement at the national level the DSA, regulatory bodies that have to respect particularly the principle of independence, which is already a challenge in itself in many European countries, and also an additional layer of complexity that is typically European, which is the fact that when it comes to very large online platforms or search engines, it is the European Commission, the competent regulatory body. And in this case, I mean, the European Commission, being also a political body, has made things particularly complicated because, of course, with the new government or the new, let's say, vision of things in the United States, the regulator has been under particular political pressure in Europe because of, let's say, the position of the government of the United States, including one of the drafters of the DSA, Thierry Breton, who is not able anymore to enter the United States because of the sanctions adopted by the United States against him. So this has, of course, an impact. It shows that geopolitically speaking, these kind of norms are very sensitive, and therefore regulators can be subject to very, very strong pressure coming not only from companies, but also from other governments like the government of the United States. No? So that's another thing that I believe it is very important. And finally, what we have seen also is that, of course, and then you need to create all these, or you need to enable, let's say, the functioning of all these, let's say, institutions. I mean, referred to in the DSA, like trusted flaggers, like third-party redress mechanisms, the role of researchers, etc. No, and now we have seen that as the DSA is being implemented, it is not that easy. No, you need to find in every member state organizations that are willing to become trusted flaggers, organizations that are willing to become these third parties that will play the function of arbitration. We need to have proper rules that go beyond the DSA, that develop the provisions of the DSA in order to guarantee that researchers have proper access to data from platforms as promised by the DSA, but requires an implementation. So we need to, one of the learnings is that, I mean, these kind of laws are, I mean, it takes time and many debates to adopt them. It takes time to, I mean, develop all the institutions, create all the institutions, all the mechanisms to implement them. And it also takes time to convince all the different organizations, civil society, companies, etc., to adopt all the measures that are necessary in order for the law to be effectively applied. Also, of course, we need to understand that in order for a law of this kind to properly operate, you need to also count on a system of checks and balances that works properly. There has to be a culture of independent regulation, which is the case in some European countries at least. There has to be a culture of the division of powers and capacity also of the judiciary to oversee, in the last instance, the decisions that might be taken in the application of this complex legal system, which is something that, again, needs to be developed. We have partially developed that in Europe, but it has not been completed yet.
Well, thanks a lot for this big overview, Professor. And also, as we move forward now, I'll ask a few questions that both of you, please, Professor Juan, Professor Matheus, feel free to jump in as I propose some discussions here for us. I think one of the first things that actually motivated this effort from Sivis Institute and the mobilization of all these partners is this preoccupation with regards to access to information, freedom of expression, and how users of these platforms can freely exchange ideas. Of course, again, together with the possibility of the explosion of the bad effects as well of these communication efforts, such as disinformation, lies, and others, right? And so the chilling effect of these sorts of regulations, because they are also complex, because they're long, they're very hard to interpret for non-experts, for example, they can lead people to feel less confident in posting investigations, in conducting conversations online on important democratic matters. And I would like to hear first from Professor Joan, how have you seen this effect take place in places, in different countries in Europe or not? Any evidence on the discussion moving forward on freedom of expression as the DSA is being implemented? Of course, again, trying to move beyond partisan feelings or effects, right? Affectations, let's say. So how has this translated into data, or even, let's say, your analysis of the member countries in the EU? So.
Yeah, well, I think that here it would be very important to differentiate between content regulation and platform regulation. The DSA is not about content regulation in principle, as a general principle, which means that, I mean, what is illegal, it is something, or the definition of what is illegal online is something that belongs to the member states on the basis of their own national legal systems. And this hasn't changed according to the DSA. So you may have countries like Hungary, where limits to freedom of expression are more strict and more invasive when it comes to what you can publish online. And other countries like, Sweden used to be a good example of that, maybe not anymore, but I mean, more, let's say, Nordic countries in general, where the Netherlands, let's say, since they are hosting us, but I mean, I think it's true that where, let's say, the approach to freedom of expression is more open. So the DSA hasn't changed that, no? But the DSA, of course, what it's doing is providing new instruments for platforms when it comes to the requests that they receive, or new standards for platforms regarding the requests that they may receive from authorities, and let's say the decisions that need to take when it comes to content moderation. And this is where you may have, let's say, the most important perhaps concern here. And in this sense, what I need to say is that on the one hand, I think we can say that the DSA has increased transparency in most of these processes. It clearly establishes the rules of the game when it comes to when the judge can ask a platform to take something down, and a clear differentiation between illegal content and harmful content. And also, for example, the fact that platforms, even when they take down content on the basis of their own terms of service, they still need to respect the fundamental rights, the Charter of Fundamental Rights. So these are some elements that may provide some safeguards, no? But on the other hand, it is also true that there are new provisions regarding in the DSA regarding due diligence, regarding due process, but also regarding, for example, the assessment of mitigation of risks that are new, that affect the way platforms moderate content, and in the last instance, they might affect, let's say, also the behavior of users. And here we still don't know exactly, I mean, how this has a true impact. But just something to put an example, no? I mean, in the DSA, we have an article, which is Article 28, that says that platforms need to adopt a series of measures to better protect minors online. No, so I mean, and Article 28 does not clearly define which are these measures, but it seems to refer to kind of a proportional approach, and it does not say, I mean, exactly because what needs to be done, because the DSA seems to understand that depending on the age, depending on the service, depending on the characteristics, platforms may need to adopt different types of measures and safeguards. No, and there are even some guidelines from the European Commission from the last summer that clearly point at this direction. But now, based also on these, some member states have said, no, since we have to protect minors, now we will adopt laws that basically impose a prohibition to access to social media, no, for minors. No, well, that's I would say a wrong interpretation of the DSA, but this is something that it is happening. No, so I think that the problem that we have now with the DSA is that in some cases, let's say some of the provisions still have not been properly developed, and therefore we see different interpretations at the national level, and some of them might be problematic in terms of freedom of expression. We still don't have case law, as it was mentioned, from the Court of Justice, and therefore, I mean, I think that at some point, or let's say we have case law in some areas, but not areas that are directly related to content. And we will see what is the margin that authorities may have to introduce certain restrictions using the DSA as an umbrella. But I would see that as a main challenge, and of course, an area of potential concern if the DSA is not properly interpreted and enforced.
Thank you for this. And Professor Juan, building on this, Matheus, from the report as well, and from this recent comment by Professor Juan, that the role of the judiciary and the rule of law in applying consistently the rules that we have for freedom of expression or for freedom of the press, consistently apply them and then apply them online as well, with more an obligation, with a need for more transparency. There has been a lot of discussion recently in Brazil of more transparency as far as content moderation goes. But as you mentioned briefly in the report and the presentation, our Supreme Court has also ruled in the matter by striking down pieces of our Marco Civil da Internet that regarded liability from content. And I wonder if you could provide us a brief comment on how do you see this role of the judiciary in Brazil as far as importing, let's say, and critically importing and improving the legislation from abroad here in Brazil. How has our judiciary played a part on this, if you care to comment?
Sure. Precisely because of this complexity, it is important that any regulatory framework we develop adheres to our constitutional principles, as we highlighted in the final section of the report. We cannot rely on models that bypass essential guarantees or delegate the definition of lawful content entirely to private intermediaries without adequate oversight. And any potential restriction on fundamental rights must respect the principle of legality, the process, the right to a full defense, and ultimately our goal is to design a regulation that mitigates digital harms while preserving a plural, safe, and democratic communicational environment, ensuring that the cure doesn't become worse than the disease. And with that context in mind, I'd like to briefly revisit and delve deeper into the report's proposals and prompting some reflection on a question that seems central to me, which is what does it mean in practice to build a platform regulation that isn't just a mere import of the European model? And the report proposes a few paths: self-regulation, transparency, co-regulation, responsive regulation, and regulation beyond the law. And these categories shouldn't be understood in isolation. They form an integrated regulatory architecture, and the core proposal of our work lies in how they articulate with one another. And take transparency, for example. On its own, the periodic disclosure of data regarding content moderation is already a less invasive alternative than expanded liability. But transparency becomes truly effective when combined with robust redress mechanisms, both judicial and out of court, and with multi-stakeholder participation in formulating and supervising regulatory policies. And it is this linkage that allows for public scrutiny without directly interfering with providers' autonomy. And co-regulation, in turn, offers something that neither pure self-regulation nor direct state regulation can ensure: flexibility for technological adaptation, paired with sanctioning mechanisms for non-compliance with negotiated duties. And this involves an articulation between principle-based legal norms and sectorally developed codes of conduct subject to periodic review. This model allows platforms, civil society, academia, and the government to negotiate concrete commitments regarding moderation practices, transparency, and the protection of rights. And it is important to know that the thesis recently established by the Brazilian Supreme Court seems to partly move in this direction by mandating the providers enact self-regulation covering notice mechanisms, due process, and annual transparency reports. The challenge moving forward is how to give effect to these obligations without replicating the problems the report identifies in the European experience. And here is perhaps the most provocative point of our work. Platform regulation doesn't end with a state legislation. The technological architecture of the providers themselves constitutes an autonomous mode of regulation capable of promoting or restricting rights, market incentives such as best practice certifications, influence corporate behavior, consolidated social practices within users' communities, can also establish standards of conduct and informal sanctioning mechanisms. And any regulation that ignores these dimensions and focuses exclusively on legal obligations risks producing limited or counterproductive results. And the message of the report is one of caution, but also of ambition. Brazil has a rich regulatory trajectory founded on the multi-stakeholder construction of the Marco Civil da Internet, and has the conditions to develop its own creative solutions that are fully compatible with the protection of freedom of expression and human rights. What we cannot do is surrender this creative capacity in the name of regulatory convergence that treats something still uncertain as a given. And we recently saw the Brazilian government present a bill to the National Congress that adopts the same logic as the European Union's Digital Markets Act. 2 weeks ago, an urgency request was approved for this bill, meaning it will bypass committee hearings in the Chamber of Deputies, reducing debates with civil society, and reinforcing the notion that the Brussels effects truly impacts Brazilian perceptions of digital regulation. And we hope our report helps bring this debate to light and allow us to take a step back to understand what we can build independently and grounded in our own cultural, socioeconomic, and legal contexts. So those were a few additional points I would like to bring to the discussion.
Thanks, Professor Matheus. And I think we are all very much aware of this rich Brazilian history in the internet regulatory debate. And we hope to, again, put us in the forefront of good examples and good legislative debate, which is not the case when we put stuff urgently to be voted in our Congress. And hopefully, Sivis, with this report and others, we can enrich this debate, bring other experts into this discussion. So thanks for bringing that to light. Professor Juan, one more question as we move into final remarks soon, but I want to delve deeper also something that was briefly mentioned in one comment about the Los Angeles trial on social media addiction, other cases where big social media platforms have been on the spotlight for their own practices, which are some of them on the target and in these sorts of regulations, such as the DSA. But also, as we mentioned, we would love to promote guiding principles such as co-regulation and self-regulation on some topics. I wonder how the social media platforms have embraced the DSA and its regulatory cascade, let's say, not in the member countries of the EU, and how has this guiding principle of co-regulation or even self-regulation in some cases been discussed in the European case?
Yeah, first of all, when it comes to, let's say, the implementation of the DSA, platforms have been trying to do their homework. No, I mean, particularly when it comes to transparency reporting, but more specifically, and I think that the most interesting part are the reports about systemic risks assessment and mitigation. No, but here we have, for example, the allegations made by civil society organizations, particularly saying that these reports basically don't say anything new, that basically these reports are an exercise of compliance, say conservative compliance, like ticking all the boxes. But I mean, the true problems of platforms in some cases associated precisely to the design or to things that go beyond content posted by users are not properly considered by these risk assessments, and that platforms only try to basically provide the European Commission with a basic compliance with the law. Also, these reports have to be independently audited, but the problem that we have is that any auditing company that might be doing this job has never done this before. They do financial audits, but they don't do this kind of auditing. So basically, they try to follow what the platforms say and use the parameters already set by the platforms. They don't innovate when it comes to the parameters. So, I mean,
it seems Professor Juan has frozen a bit.
Yes. Can you still hear me?
You're back.
Can you still hear me? Something happened. No. So that was basically what I was saying. I think is that, I mean, there's this sensation that, I mean, this is a very expensive exercise that basically consists of reporting a lot, saying things that we already knew, and that for platforms to explain what they have been doing so far already, but just to put it on paper. So, I mean, among civil society, etc., there's some degree of frustration in the sense that, well, much hasn't changed with the DSA, no. So that is a little bit of the feeling here, no. But also, I mean, we need to understand that, of course, I mean, the legislator started introducing new obligations to see if they work, no. And also, we were hoping that regulators would be able to kind of properly assess how these, let's say, obligations are fulfilled, no. But regulators are also puzzled. They don't, well, I don't know how to assess if something was properly done or not, because this is the first time we are doing it, no. So I would emphasize the fact that, I mean, introducing many new obligations in any law doesn't really mean anything if you really don't have a clear standard on how to assess the compliance with such obligations. No, I think that this is a very important lesson from the European experience. No, you need to, I mean, also educate, let's say, regulators in this field. When it comes to co-regulation, probably this has been an interesting exercise because it has forced the European Commission to talk to platforms and try to find common solutions. And we have, let's say, these kind of exercises in the field of disinformation, in the field of hate speech. I mean, we've seen that. Even this comes from before the DSA. No, but we need to be very careful with these kind of negotiations, because, I mean, sometimes, I mean, one could say is that, I mean, of course, the position of the regulator is a position of force and of authority, so to speak. And even if we are talking about co-regulation, there might be cases where basically it is the regulator who's imposing on the private companies the obligations. No, and also something that we haven't properly seen is a proper human rights impact assessment when it comes to all these matters. No, I mean we have seen a kind of a formal implementation of the DSA based on the provisions of the DSA, but when it comes to, for example, when let's say a co-regulatory instrument would go so too far and therefore would be incompatible with the right to freedom of expression, this is a standard that the European Commission has never set, has never established, no, and it's still to be established, no, and this is a reason, for example, for concern, no. So in this sense, I mean, let's say the risk of formalistic compliance is clearly there, and the risk of, let's say, regulatory perplexity at the beginning, at the initial stages, is still there, no? So yeah, I mean, this is again a process under construction, clearly.
Sure, and hopefully this report, again, as we emphasize, is an effort on this direction that we can learn from other experiences and adapt them. But I'm glad to hear from civil society organizations around the world, and including in Europe, are busy taking care of this learning process as well, right? As we move on, I would like to ask both of you for final remarks, starting with Professor Matheus. I wonder, how do you see us moving forward in the regulatory debate in Brazil with these new regulations of digital markets and others, but also putting in something from the chat as well from YouTube, with this change in the role of social media networks from, neutral distributors to active distributors of content. So how do you see us moving forward in this debate in Brazil?
I was hearing Juan, and there is a parallel debate that has grown considerably in Brazil over the last few months. The protection of children and adolescents on the internet, driven by the recent approval of the ECA Digital. And this legislation establishes several measures to prevent youth addiction to social media, and demonstrating the importance and urgency of this discussion. The core issue we face is how to effectively balance the well-being of children and adolescents with their right to access the new technologies and the internet itself. And today, our National Data Protection Authority is beginning their regulatory process for this law. So this is the moment to establish this equilibrium, guaranteeing the robust protection of our youth while promoting their appropriate and safe access to the digital environment. But as the question in the chat, the transition of social media platforms from neutral distributors to active curators and promoters of content is at the very heart of the current regulatory debate in Brazil. When the Marco Civil da Internet was established, it enriched a model of liability by omission, creating an architecture that privileged freedom of expression. And under its Article 19, providers were generally only held liable for third-party content if they fail to comply with a specific judicial order to remove it. However, the consolidation of new business models on the internet has altered the dynamics of communication and social organization over recent years. And today, the spread of harmful content such as disinformation constitutes a phenomenon that involves coordinated manipulation and the exploitation of biases. And this systemic spread relies on platform acting as active distributors through algorithm recommendation and target monetization rather than just passive hosting. And recognizing this shift, the Supreme Court of Brazil established the partial unconstitutionality of the Marco Civil's original model. The court founded that the general rule no longer conferred sufficient protection to fundamental rights and democracy. And the court established that providers can now be held civilly liable for illicit content generated by third parties in certain situations, even without a prior court order. And crucially, the scenarios outlined by the court directly address the platform's active role. Liability occurs in cases involving the paid boosting of illicit content, or when there is a verified systemic failure to remove serious criminal posts, such as those related to anti-democratic conduct and crimes against vulnerable persons. And while this judicial update rightfully acknowledged the active distribution role of platforms, our report cautions about how we regulate this transition moving forward. And concrete experience has demonstrated that expanded liability regimes tend to produce excessive removals and self-censorship. And therefore, our future regulation must balance the need to mitigate these systemic risks with the preservation of a plural communicational environment resistant to state interference. And we argue that instead of relying solely on expanded liability, addressing the active nature of platforms we should focus on obligations of algorithm transparency, periodic data disclosure on content moderation, and judicial and extrajudicial contestation mechanisms. And these are less invasive alternatives that still hold active distributors accountable while protecting our democratic debate. So that's it. That's some remarks for the debate.
Thanks, Professor Matheus. And any last words as we move to Professor Juan for closing remarks?
Yeah, so, yes. You want me to? Yes.
Yes, please. And please share us a bit as well as we come here from a Brazilian perspective, looking at the European influence. How do we see this in other places of the world? And where do you see this discussion moving forward as we learn more and more in practice how this implementation goes, right?
Yeah, sure. I mean, first of all, I would say that I agree when it comes to Brazil. I agree with what my colleague Matheus has just said. I think that this is exactly what needs to be done in Brazil. I think that it is very important to preserve the intermediary liability exemptions, not only because this is a good, in terms of a good model from a comparative perspective, but we need to take into account that this is a standard that has been set as the standard by, let's say, the UN Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Expression and the Special Rapporteur for Freedom of Expression in the region of the Americas. So it is something that is demanded from the point of view of international human rights standards. The second thing is that I believe it's very important to stress the importance of moving towards a regulatory system that imposes obligations on platforms that have to do with process, that have to do with protection of users, but are not content-oriented. Imposing on a platform the obligation to take care of specific types of content, it is a delegation, a privatization of the power to regulate content, and this is something that is, I believe, incompatible with the idea of democratic regulation and democracy. I know that in Brazil there's this temptation to say, now platforms, you have to define what is this information and you have to deal with it. That I think that I understand the concern behind this, but I think that this is a wrong approach for the reasons I just mentioned. And finally, I think that we need to be particularly aware of the institutional side. No, we adopt a law, but we will need at least a regulatory body, and we need to ask ourselves, in any country, has this country a tradition of independent regulation? Can we create a regulatory body that will not be controlled by the government? And also, can we have a regulatory system that is resistant to political change, no? That will not be used by different political approaches to persecute those who lost the elections. No, we need to see that this has to be a model that where everybody feels comfortable, not a model to deal with specific types of content that now we don't like vis-a-vis other types of content that we don't care much about. No, so I think that this politically neutral approach to the question, the institutional component, make sure that we will be able to count on the right institutions, and also preserve some basic standards that can be found in international documents. I think that these are very, very important lessons and very important components that unfortunately now in many countries are not necessarily respected or taken into account. And I think it's very important, considering the liberal tradition in terms of freedom of expression and human rights of Brazil, that this is properly contemplated in this new legislation.
Yes, and thank you very much, Professors Juan, Professor Matheus. I know that this is not a closed debate. We're just ending this live discussion here and directing the attention of everyone here watching now live and later on to the report launched last year, DSA Brasileiro, right, by Sivis Institute, and also by the work both Matheus and Juan have done themselves at ITS Rio, in the case of Matheus, as a researcher, professor there, and Professor Juan now at Queen Mary University in the Center for Law, Democracy and Society. So I direct you all to follow more closely on the work that these two have done. And also, of course, invite you to follow Instituto Sivis in our publications on this topic as the regulatory debate in Brazil moves on. An election year, it's a highly contested topic as well, for the space for digital regulations. And I also need to send our thanks again to the Netherlands, Kingdom of Netherlands Embassy in Brazil for supporting this project, and Sivis Institute's work on the promotion of human rights, democracy here in Brazil. So thank you all very much for participating today, and I hope to see you soon. Bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you. Obrigado.